I will group Asia's challenges into 4 areas. First, at a very broad level, are the fundamental uncertainties now raised and being questioned by many people of the apparent failure of the Anglo-Saxon model of financial sector regulation and development, as well as financial stability management. At the extreme, these paradigms seem to have to put blind faith in markets and a likely regulated private sector, including a belief that markets, especially the financial and capital markets, will regulate themselves. But Asian countries have never had a blind belief that the markets work best all the time, or that the public sector is inherently always inferior to the private sector. Asian countries have long recognized that markets are, after all, human institutions, and markets can work imperfectly. Government intervention and guidance might therefore be needed to ensure that markets function well. The challenge for Asian policymakers is to chart an appropriate path between private sector leadership and appropriate public intervention and regulation in the development and management of Asian countries' financial sectors. The second area of challenge for Asia is for policymakers to respond flexibly to risks as the global economy recovers. One medium-term challenge in many countries is how to manage rising asset prices. Across the region, we have seen significant rises in equity and real estate prices on the back of domestic reflationary policies and capital inflows supported by low global interest rates. These have not in general hit their previous peak and can be justified by positive fundamentals, but continued low interest rates could push these prices higher and eventually lead to another bubble. As in the early 1990s, managing large capital inflows and prospective bubbles will be a major task for policymakers in the next few years. Asian countries have to be very vigilant so that they do not repeat the same mistakes which led to the Asian financial crisis in 1997. While not my central expectation, Asian policymakers might also have to respond more forcefully if recovery in the US and OECD turns out to be weaker than expected and the world finds itself again threatened by another recession. The third area of challenge for Asia is a need to rebalance to a more sustainable economic growth model. This is particularly true for countries with large populations like China and India. Asia's economic growth model will need to be reoriented from depending largely on exports to a more balanced model which is also dependent on services and domestic consumption. Such rebalancing will be helpful in 3 ways. First, as growth in the developed world, hereto underpinned by the US consumer market, is likely to remain weak over the next few years, stronger domestic demand may help to mitigate some of this weakness. Second, insofar as some of this rebalancing will be done through increased domestic investment, it could help to improve productivity and an economy's productive capacity. A more balanced growth could also help to reduce income inequality. Third, more balanced growth will reduce pressure on the environment. As noted earlier, a growth model that is heavily dependent on resources will soon hit constraints given the amount of supply available, so innovation and adaptation are necessary. And this brings me to the fourth and final important challenge for Asia arising from economic crisis. Asian financial institutions and markets have been given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The globalized Western banking system, hampered by capital constraints and re-regulation, will likely not be able to intermediate the massive capital demand needed to finance growth in Asia. This leaves the playing field unusually open for Asian banks and other financial institutions and markets, particularly over the next few years. Fortunately, Asian banks generally came into the crisis much healthier than their global counterparts, given the experience of the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s. Capital, liquidity, and non-performing assets were at healthy levels, while exposures to toxic assets of the Asian banks were limited. Asian household, business and government sectors are relatively unleveraged with excess debt. In order to take advantage of this opportunity, however, Asian banks and capital markets will need to develop quickly to step into the breach. In this context, regulatory and development authorities in the financial sector in Asia will need to cooperate as never before with each other and world financial institutions to develop regional financial and capital markets.